Do people still read what I call the funny papers, the comics? Well, some of you may know of a comic strip called Calvin and Hobbes. Do you? It's about a little boy and his playmate who's a talking tiger by the name of Hobbes. One day, Calvin decided to start his own small business. And Hobbes came and saw him one day in the afternoon, and Calvin was sitting under a sign that talked about what his business was all about. A sign that said, "Kick in the butt, $1. Kick in the butt for $1. So Hobbes said to him, "Calvin, how's your business been going today?" And he says, "I don't understand it. I've had no customers, and I don't understand why. Because there's so many people in the world that need a good kick in the butt." Speaking of kick in the butt, that gets us to our first reading from the book of the prophet Jeremiah, who spent most of his career as a prophet kicking people in the butt. You know, there's a cliche that says the job description for a classical prophet is twofold. One, they're supposed to comfort the afflicted, and two, they're supposed to afflict the comfortable. And Jeremiah spent most of his life afflicting the comfortable. You see, he had a twofold message that the people in his time did not want to accept. 600 years before the birth of Christ, the Babylonian Empire was on the rise. They were the new superpower in the world. Babylon, we call that now Iraq, in the person of King Nebuchadnezzar. And they were going around gobbling up country after country into their empire, and they were on the way towards Judah and Jerusalem and the temple. And Jeremiah kept telling them that it was futile to try to resist the Babylonians. They should just surrender and save their lives. The people thought he was a peacenik. He was a traitor. And so they punished him in various ways for that message. They beat him, they whipped him, they threw him into the stocks, they verbally abused him, physically abused him, everything else, because they didn't want to believe that message of his. Because you see, they put all their faith in the Davidic covenant. Now remember, that's the covenant between God and his people, in which God said there would always be a descendant of David on the throne in Jerusalem, and they had the temple. So the people thought they were invulnerable, that God would absolutely have to come to their rescue. Jeremiah said, no, it's not going to happen. Moreover, he pointed out to them that they had not kept the Sinai covenant, you know, the covenant with Moses, the Ten Commandments, the Torah, the law, the book of Deuteronomy. And because of that, they would be punished for forsaking that covenant as well. He gave one of the most famous speeches in his life called the Temple speech, which starts out, temple, temple, temple. Temple's not going to save you. It'll be destroyed if you resist the Babylonians. And of course they did. And of course it happened just like Jeremiah said. Now in today's reading, the last of the Davidic kings, King Zedekiah, is on the throne. The Babylonians haven't conquered them yet. And we hear how, at the request of the princes, Zedekiah had Jeremiah thrown down into the cistern, into the mud, to die of starvation. Fortunately, a Cushite, and you know, people from Cush, or from what we now call Ethiopia, pleaded with the king to bring Jeremiah back up and save his life. But this is another example of how they punished Jeremiah for his message, because they just didn't want to hear it. It's the same with Jesus, isn't it? He had a message that afflicted the comfortable as well. He had a message that people didn't want to hear either. And what they did to him, they crucified him for that. And Jesus himself felt compelled to warn his followers that if they followed him, well, they could expect pain and suffering in their lives too. Jeremiah is thought to be the one prophet from the Old Testament that's most like Jesus, because of all the suffering he went through for his message, just like Jesus went through his suffering for his message. Now, you and I know from our human experience there's lots of pain and suffering in the world, and it happens to the good, the bad, and the indifferent. We have a feeling if we've done something that inflicts the pain, we can understand it. If we've not done something to cause the pain, then we think that life is unjust. There was a famous book some years ago by Scott Peck called The Road Less Traveled. Do you remember that? And at the very beginning of the book, he makes a very profound statement. He says that life is difficult. Now, that's not the profound statement. The profound statement is in the next part of the sentence. He says, life is difficult, but not so difficult for those who realize life is difficult. In other words, we understand that, then we have a better job of taking care of the difficulties and pain and suffering in our lives. If we don't expect that, then we feel like life is unjust. Remember the lyrics from that hit song from many years ago? I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden. Well, there's a story about a man at a Jewish synagogue, and he decided to do a good deed. There was a man who came to synagogue who was in a wheelchair. He really wasn't a close friend or neighbor of the man, but he always went out of his way to push the man around in the synagogue wherever he needed to get to. He did a good deed. And guess what? On one of those days he was pushing the man, he had a stroke. Wound up in the hospital. Fortunately for him, it was a small stroke, but still it was a stroke. It was painful and very inconvenient. And while he was laying there in bed, he said to one of his family, something I bet you've said more than once in your life: no good deed goes unpunished. You ever said that? I know I have. You see, we think that if we do what God wants, that God will do what we want when we want it. And sometimes he does, and sometimes he doesn't. Now, perhaps the truth of the matter is that the causes of our pain and suffering, the circumstances, the situations, are not really the crux of the matter. Perhaps the pain and suffering can be handled better if we had a different attitude. There's another book that has a very interesting story in it that I think explains this. It's called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And it's all small stuff. It's about two bricklayers out laying bricks out in the hot sun. And a guy comes up to one of them and says, what are you doing? He says, well, I'm an overworked, underpaid bricklayer out here in the sun, sweating day after day, piling one brick upon another. Bricklayer number two, what are you about? Well, I feel very happy and blessed because while I'm putting this brick upon brick, I'm building this beautiful edifice, this home, this house, this building, this cathedral, whatever it happens to be. Attitude. You see, in a certain sense, they're both right? They're both true. They really were probably underpaid and overworked, and they were out in the hot sun, sweating, doing a hard job. But they also were building something that's very, very constructive. Sometimes we just can't see the plans God has for us in our lives. Sometimes in my life, I feel like both of those bricklayers. Sometimes I feel like the bricklayer who thinks he's blessed and doing wonderful things. Because there are days when the church working through me might bring somebody back to the faith who's been away from the church for 30 years through confession. Or I baptize a baby like I did Marie Borkowski's little boy yesterday, our principal at the school. Or I say Mass and give communion, or I go visit a hospital and I anoint somebody who's very sick or maybe even dying. And you can tell the sense of serenity and peace that comes to that person, and also to their whole family around them in that bed. And I feel like God has really, really, really blessed me. Then on other days, I feel like Jeremiah. I'm in that dark pit, in the muck and the mire. Oh my God, we got this debt. What's going on with the school? I can't do anything right. I get all these complaints. Blah, blah, blah. I get beat up all the time. So I feel like both. But that's because I can't see the plan that God has for me. And God does have a plan. He has a plan for me and for you. And this is where our boy Jeremiah comes into play. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Real life example of me. I'm sitting in London, England. I'm the XO of the Naval Medical Clinics in the United Kingdom. I'm a full commander. I'm supposed to be going to Portsmouth, New Hampshire for my next duty station. I never get there. They lied to me. And instead of wanting me to go to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, they want me to pick up and the next day get a plane and fly to Charleston, South Carolina. How long do I have to think about this? 24 hours. Jeez whiz. I'm supposed to be here another year and a half, and now you want me to pick up and leave, and you promised me I was going to North. I told them no. And the detailer said to me, actually he sang it, "We won't hold this against you." I knew what was coming next. I called back some months later. What do you have for me? Nothing. Nothing comparable to any job I had in the last 10 years. And in Millington, Tennessee, I wind up. In the wrong job, in the wrong place. So after the first Iraqi war, I thought, they didn't have to lie to me. I've been a team player all my career. I spent 6 years in Washington, D.C. I ran a code at the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery as an 04, usually as an 06. And they did this to me? I'm out of here. So I retire. But I bought a home when I got here 2 years before on Elmore Road. And I was a parishioner at St. Anne's in Bartlett. And one day, I was in the back of the church where the vesting sacristy was, and the old confessional in the old days. And there was a sign on the wall for John the 23rd National Seminary. And I took a card and I mailed it off. To make a long story short, and I could go on for a while, but I won't, I went to seminary and became a priest. I would not be a priest today talking to you if the Navy hadn't lied to me and sent me to the wrong place in the wrong job. There was a plan there, but it took from 1992 to 2000 for me to understand what God had in store. Our second reading from Hebrews is the greatest example of this you could ever find. It's the example of Jesus Christ. On that first Good Friday, Jesus of Nazareth seemed to be the biggest loser who ever lived. He had gone around performing miracles and teaching and preaching and talking about the kingdom of God and all that kinds of stuff. And here he was, dying a horrible, excruciating death on a cross. And where were his followers? Behind closed doors, afraid like rabbits. Or they were bewildered, like remember the two disciples on the road to Emmaus? But God the Father had a plan. And in that plan, instead of being the greatest loser in the history of the world, Jesus was the greatest winner in the history of the world. Rose from the dead. And it took him a while for his disciples to figure out what the plan was. And sometimes that has to do with you and me too, and the pain and suffering that we experience in our lives. We have to have faith. Faith in God. That like Jeremiah says he has a plan for you and for me. And when we face that pain and suffering in our lives, we have to have faith and trust in him that he will give us eternal joy for all of us who are faithful to him. I'm taking my sign. I need it at 11.